Okay, well, we're ready to go again, and our last speaker today is Martin Jones, our Vice Master, obviously well known to most people here. Martin is the George Pitt Rivers Professor of Archaeological Science. So, archaeology, prehistory, but Martin's going to talk a lot about the application of science to figuring out what was going on and securing the clues. But you might want to remind yourself from your menu what you ate for lunch, because he's going to be talking about some of the key ingredients of that menu. So, Martin, before the Silk Road, food and globalization in prehistory. Over to you.
Thank you, Mary. Well, hello everyone, and I'm aware that I'm the last speaker, so I'll try not to make it too heavy. But when we share food, we do two things, and we intertwine them. On the one hand, there is the whole issue of the food quest, and getting enough calories and nutrients, and engaging with nature to produce that and get the right amounts and the right quantities. But once we've done that, we mix up the ingredients and stuff in the most complicated ways to tell a whole series of stories. And those are stories about who we are and who we are not, and stories about where we've come from and where we hope to go to. And those stories can be on many scales simultaneously. So we may, when we share food, be talking about our family, our tribe, our religious community, and we might be alluding to our life experience, or to several centuries, or to several millennia. And some of the stories embedded in the way that we share food go back to early Homo sapiens in Africa. Now, my work is to kind of probe down to try and unpick those deep time stories that are part of our sharing food. But in order to approach that and tell you something about the research that my research group are doing, I want to do a sort of archaeology of your lunch, and you've already started your homework, so I hope you're concentrating. Now, if you look at the menus and look at something which tells a story, I think the clue with this one is it's in a foreign language, so we can see that our pasta arrabbiata, we immediately think of Italy, and many Italian families would see it as something that they've eaten and their grandmother made, and so on and so forth. But when we start unpicking the ingredients, it all gets a bit more complicated. So two of the key ingredients in the pasta arrabbiata are the things that give it its flavor, the chilies and the tomatoes. And both of these come from domesticated in America. So the tomatoes in the mountainous regions of Peru, and the chilies in Mexico. And so that's a bit puzzling. And then if we look at the rest of it, the noodles and the whole idea of tagliatelle or spaghetti, although the classical Romans had something that was lasagna, something like a lasagna, they didn't have noodles. And so as far as we can tell, the noodles come from China. And there is an image of the oldest noodles in the world. That's an upturned pot, and those are the early noodles. They're about 4,000 years old from central China. And so that comes from the other end. And the interesting too, it's not just the noodles. I suspect you were eating your noodles your tagliatelle with a fork. And all of the technology of not touching food comes from these too. So this is the earliest knife and fork I know from, and this is also from more or less the same time period in the same place as the earliest noodles. So if we unpick what a dish like pasta arrabbiata is about, it is an Italian dish, but it's a mercantile swaggering dish. I mean, in a sense, its origins are with Venetian merchants who are not celebrating their ancestry, they're celebrating their mercantile power and decorating their cuisine with the limits of their mercantile power, both in terms of the overland Silk Route and maritime trade. And this is what a lot of cuisine is about, that its origins are in some sort of swaggering expression of imperial power, and then it gradually gets internalized as something very local. And if I was at school teaching about the history of the British Empire, what I get the school kids to do is to unpick a Christmas pudding, and you can find the entire history of the British Empire in the ingredients for a Christmas pudding. So a key element about the pasta arrabbiata is it's about a major period of food globalization that is well studied, and it's described as the Colombian Exchange, and obviously from the name it's after 1492. And all sorts of things moved around the world. Maize and potatoes moved not just to Europe and Africa, but the missing arrows on this one are in China. It's clear that by the 17th century, a number of these New World crops were in China, and various flavorings are going backwards and forwards. And then from the old world, wheat, in particular wheat, but also pigs, rye, and cattle are going into the New World. And two things were going on in parallel in terms of that process. On the one hand, there is that imperial bringing together of food from all over the place. And the other thing that's happening is that staples are moving around, and such as the sweet potato and the potato you had at lunch, and they're coming to the old world largely not so much for the sort of showing off menu, but basically as a staple food plant for various workforces who are trying to get calories out of a very small plot of land. And so the Irish potato on the small plots on the large English estates are one example, and the potatoes and sweet potatoes you get the same thing both in West Africa and in China. So that was a period of very important globalization of food. Well, let's move to another one of your it's not written in Thai, but you can tell from the name that has an association too with a particular place, the Thai fish curry. And looking at the ingredients of these and where these came, you have coriander. Actually, it's from Southwest Asia, like a lot of foodstuffs. And then peppercorns, which are from the Malabar coast in India, coconut from the Indian Ocean and Southeast Asia, and ginger from South China. So they're quite spread out. And the interesting thing about these ones is as well as being a Thai dish and reflecting some movement of crops, all of these ingredients could be found in Roman Europe. And so, well, coriander, not surprisingly. There's some really interesting digs now on Roman Egypt and the ports along Roman Egypt, in which things like ginger and coconut and vast quantities of peppercorns are showing up. And they were feeding a similar sort of cuisine. So this sort of dish would be not an unsurprising dish in Roman Europe, again to display, if you like, the power of the Roman Empire and the limits of the Roman Empire. And as I say, in particularly in the ports of Egypt, you can find a whole series of these examples. But even if you were unlucky as a Roman soldier and got posted to the awful weather of the offshore island of Britannia, then you still had some of these things. There's a series of peppercorns that have turned up in the Roman sites in Britain. So this whole idea of marking out your identity by something from the distant reaches of the empire is something that happened there. So this dish reflects an earlier episode that was particularly important in food globalization, which is really sort of the beginnings of a Silk Road. Now, I know the Silk Road into the medieval period we think of, for obvious reasons, as the overland route of the Silk Road. And more information now is emphasizing the maritime routes along the Indian Ocean and up into the Red Sea. And this is both archaeology, as I say, particularly of Egyptian sites, but also there is some textual evidence. Here's a list of the 3rd century AD plants from the west, the Wailue, which is largely a series of quite fancy things, but it has rosemary in there, turmeric, saffron, white aconite, rue oil. And then from a classical source, the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, you can see a number of things there that are featured in your lunch: sesame, pepper, and coconut, all showing up there. So this is a second episode. Now these are, for my research, quite late episodes, both the classical period globalization and the Colombian globalization. And the thing that, and I just wanted to add another point here of your desserts. Now just a sort of aside here, I mentioned earlier that food is about saying who we are and who we are not. Now, I don't know how you ate the food, but I guess quite a lot of you will have started with the savory options and gone on to eat the dessert afterwards. But a number of you will be familiar that that's not necessarily the case if you go to, if you like, Arabic cuisine, where you can have honey and sweet things and almonds in the cuisine earlier in the course. It's still not true in rural China. I've noticed recently that the big cities of China are going Western and having the dessert after the savory course. And it certainly wasn't true in the Roman world, where sweet and savory were all mixed up. And if one tracks back the order in which you ate it, and which a eminent anthropologist, Jack Goody, did, he traced it back to medieval southern France. And there it was clear what was happening was, or his interpretation was, those communities were sorting out their cuisine into sweet, then savory, then sweet, in order to emphasize that they weren't Muslims. And so it was by a performance of how you eat food placed the community into who they were Christians and who they weren't Muslims. Now, I'm sure that when you did the same thing, there was no implicit aggro towards religious minorities in your choice, but it's an example of how those historic things get incorporated into how we think it's totally normal to eat. But anyway, in terms of the ingredients, the apples are a really interesting one. All the apples that we eat as domestic apples, their ancestry traces back to valleys in Tajikistan, and we're not entirely sure when they moved out, but it's clear that by the Roman period, apples of Tajik ancestry were in Europe. Sesame is from South India, and again, by the similar period, it was everywhere, 2,000 years ago it was everywhere from Africa to Han China. And the banana is a really interesting one. There is something called a phytolith, a silica particle that you can identify bananas from. And what people think or have argued is the edible banana has turned up in Africa in 500 AD. So there's lots of hints of these spreads across the world. Well, this is the one that, after all those tastings, I was delighted to hear from Mary that the millet all got finished up, because this is the plant, or the series of plants that I've become particularly interested in over the last 10 years and done a lot of research on. And millets are a series of small grain cereals, and there's a lot of them around the world, and a large number of millet species that have their origins either to the regions of south of the Sahara in Africa, or two key ones, broomcorn and foxtail, have their origins in Inner Mongolia in North China. Now, it's neither a series of crops that modern agronomists are that interested in. They're much more interested in the wheat, rice, and maize, the large-grained cereals. And it has, before we worked on it, it wasn't really a crop that archaeobotanists and archaeologists were interested in. And I got interested in it doing a completely different project by accident. When it became clear that there were remains of the Asian millets in prehistoric Europe. And what unfolded into one of those productive periods of my research career was just working on this puzzle of why there was a Chinese crop, sort of bird seed, in prehistoric sites in Europe. And at the time, the kind of model of what the spread of agriculture was like was that, on the one hand, in the purple, you had these major crops, wheat and barley, which very early on, by about 4,000 or 5,000 BC, had spread around Europe, around North Africa, and into India. And at a similar time, there was clearly a parallel spread of rice in East Asia. And as I say, the thing that was completely puzzling was that in small quantities, there seemed to be Asian millets mixed up with the regular Western crops in Europe. And I went out with another past Darwin fellow, Jinli Liu, in 2005 to go and track down the archaeobotany and the archaeology of millet in North China. And it just happened at a time when my field of archaeology, archaeobotany, was taking off, that they were finding lots and lots of millet in China. But in addition, for the first time, some of my Chinese colleagues were finding wheat and barley in 4,500-year-old deposits in China. So looking for the millet and looking for it in China started opening up a much more complicated pattern in which millet was going one way and wheat and barley were going the other way. And at the same time, other groups, apart from ourselves, were finding other mixtures, and Dorian Fuller's group in London were doing a lot of work around North India and finding that, again, sites of the 3rd millennium BC, about 4,500 years ago, had rice from Asia, the African millets from Africa, as well as the Southwest Asian crops in China. So this was all coming together in something that by the 3rd millennium BC was in place and is the earlier episode of food globalization in prehistory, largely involving these staple energy crops and spreading right across Asia and Europe. And the thing that was kind of really interesting about this is it was happening before the Silk Road, obviously, but if you look at the evidence of burials and so of archaeology, you can push back elements of the Silk Road route to about 1200 BC. And this globalization was happening long before that and before there was elements of fancy goods. And the way one can interpret that is that this was pretty much a bottom-up thing. It didn't involve, it wasn't led by chiefs and merchants with rich graves and so forth. It seemed to be something that was happening without a material imprint. Well, because it doesn't have a material imprint, we have to look for it and understand it using a series of methods that are variously novel or less conventional. And in our project, Food Globalization in Prehistory, we've pulled together 3 different forms of work. And one is looking at genetics. I'm going to say something a bit about genetics. The changes in genetics over the last 15 years have completely transformed archaeology. And I think the geneticists themselves, as different genomes started getting understood and coded and so forth, I think it surprised everybody, including the geneticists, how much historical information was in there, how much, as well as the functional thing of making proteins and making organisms, there was masses of information that related to hundreds of years ago, thousands of years ago, millions of years ago. And so genetics and the possibility of genetic analysis has really transformed archaeology. So we've used genetics to get broad geographical patterns with some sense of time depth. Another field which is quite interesting is stable isotope dietary studies. And that is looking at stable isotopes of particularly carbon, nitrogen, and oxygen in the bones, which chart what particular individuals have eaten. And if you get discrimination in isotopes in the crops, that'll get mirrored in what's in the isotopic pattern in the bones. And so we can use stable isotope dietary studies on precisely dated cemeteries and look at regional food patterns and who's eating what in different places. And then this is the more old-fashioned thing of looking at charred cereal grains from archaeological sites. And from those preserved grains, getting precise dates and precise taxonomy. So those three go together to kind of build a map of what's going on. And I'm just going to give you a taster of two of those to give you a feel of how we proceed on that. Here's my colleague Harriet Hunt, one of the group, and she is one of the prime geneticists in the group. And what's in her flower pots in the Botanic Garden, each one of these is what we call a land race. And what a land race is the way I define a land race is if farmers buy their seed corn in a market, it's not a land race, it's a commercial cultivar. If they get it from their parents or their friends or within the kin network, then that's what a land race is. And these land races preserve an extraordinary geographical imprint that one can relate to deep patterns in a way that I'll show you in a minute. So this might be a millet from Kazakhstan, and this one might be a millet from Romania, and so forth. And she's just growing them up so she can do genetic analysis and try and build up geographical pictures. Most of the genetics we do is on land races and looking for the history within the living crop. We do two other things. One is, as you can well imagine, the 20th century has seen the loss of an enormous number of land races as farming around the world has got streamlined. And so there's a really useful backup, which is what we call historic DNA, which is basically things that are plants that have been preserved dry for, say, 100 years or 200 years. And their DNA is pretty intact. And this is from the Vavilov Herbarium in St. Petersburg. And just by looking at the historic DNA, we get some of that lost diversity of the 20th century and greatly enrich the landrace complement from modern fields. The third form is, these are millet grains about the same age as that pasta, 4,000 years old. And these have pretty good DNA conservation in. But as with all ancient DNA, it's harder work to get the genetic sequence. So we use the archaeological, the really ancient DNA, for hypothesis testing. Once we build a hypothesis about what's going on from the modern material, we say, well, if we're right, in Xinjiang in West China in 4000 BC, it should look like this. And then we test it against those archaeological specimens. So we put those three together in that manner. And this is the kind of map we go. So Harriet there, she's used some, for those who aren't geneticists, the only thing that you need to know about this is that these are genetic sequences that are what we call non-coding. They don't actually make proteins, so they're not part of the functioning of the plant today. And they're the ones that embody a massive history. And in this case, each of those circles there is one of the land races, and the ellipses are just to group together, if you like, a series of lines or tribes, or a series of lineages within those land races. And you'll see where they all coincide, or where all but one coincide, is in North China, in just the same place that archaeologically we find the earliest millet remains. And in a nutshell, each one of these lineages is a story, preserves a story of millet spreading from its region of origin to another part of the world. So these are the millets that spread into China, and the yellow and the red ones are the ones that got as far as Europe. So it creates a kind of a geography that we can start drilling down and saying, well, what is the yellow one? What is the red one? And how can we nail that to archaeological stories? So a lot of that sort of broader geography is by looking at bits of genetics that don't actually make sequence for proteins. More and more, we're also looking at the genes that do actually do something in the living plant. And I just want to mention one of them, which is about stickiness. And I'm delighted that Fergus got you some sticky cereal as part of, to accompany the Thai fish curry. And this is a really interesting thing about, it's not about the ecology of the plant, it's about culinary choices. And in East Asia, there's a really, really long tradition of whole grain boiling, steaming, and sticky cuisine. And if you have this slurpy, sticky stuff, then you also need something to hold it, which explains what this is a steamer from about 2000 BC, which in East Asia, pottery is much older than it is in West Asia. And the whole idea of sitting around a pot of sticky, slurpy stuff and really favoring the stickiness of it is something that seems to have a really deep history in East Asia, going way back beyond agriculture itself. And as I mentioned, you need some technology to pick up sticky stuff. And I've shown some more recent forks here. These are Byzantine forks of the 9th century AD. And forks, as we well know, came to Europe. And in the first stages, these were regarded as quite suspect things. And the church in particular didn't like forks. And I think there were two reasons there. I mean, one was the place where merchants first found forks was probably in some East Mediterranean port, where it may be that someone was sitting on their client's knee, sort of feeding them sweetmeats with these dodgy things. But in addition, the church was clear that God gave you hands. You know, why do you need to invent these things? And just to get, before looping back to genetics, there's an equally old tradition in the West of handheld food and a performance of breaking and dividing and sharing. And the ones on, I've just got two examples here of that tradition. But that's a tradition that, again, goes way back, the idea both of a baked loaf that you can break and split, but if one switches onto other forms of cuisine in the West, if you think of the roast and the barbecue, that's rather similar. I mean, someone cuts it up and divides it out like that. So a completely different performance and a completely different way of thinking about food, which again you can see started moving towards the east. Those are some cakes from Han Tomb in Gansu, 1st century BC, and some modern decorated white loaves. In terms of the antiquity of this, one of my proud archaeology discoveries is on a 25-year-old archaeological site in Central Europe, where I think that my team found the oldest burnt breadcrumbs. Now, it happens to be on the same site that has the oldest three-dimensional human representations. And it's only when I have a captive audience like this, I can try and persuade you that my burnt breadcrumbs are at least as important as this turning point in the history of art. So humour me. But going back to the genetics, one element of stickiness is that there are genes for that sticky. That sticky rice that you had today, what's happened in that is, for those of you who are chemists, the amylose starch has been really reduced, and the amylopectin is dominating the starch, and so there's been a genetic switch to change the starch chemistry, and you can pick that up you can pick that up in the genes. And this is just Harriet's groups again, and it won't surprise you at all that almost all of the sticky genes are over in the east. But the reason I show you this one is because there's a few examples over in the west of unexpressed sticky genes in the western millets. In other words, they're kind of like I think it's our tonsils that used to be gills when we were fish. They're a silent memory of what things used to be like when they came from Asia. So again, before this prehistoric spread into Europe, there was the sticky cuisine there. And the interesting thing is it was selected against, but not removed when these cereals came to the West. At the same time as when barley in particular went east, they selected for sticky versions of barley. So you can get sticky barley and sticky oat and sticky rye in the east. I just want to quickly mention something about the isotopic evidence. So this is one of a series of cemeteries on something called the Hershey Corridor, which is a corridor between the east and the west, down which a lot of the contact in this early period happened. And one of the things we can do, as I mentioned, with the bones from these cemeteries, is we can pick out, by looking at the isotopic balance in them, we can get a sense of what they ate. And I'll just show you some data from 4 cemeteries in that Hershey corridor. and these, I'll explain this in a minute with a couple of loops, but there's the carbon isotope balance down on the bottom axis. And they come in 2 groups against that bottom axis. And to cut a long story short, this is about the measure you would get if you only ate millet, which is a C4 crop. And this is the measure you get if you eat a mix of millet and of either wheat or barley. And so you can see around 2000 BC, when these new crops were coming in from the rest to this point in China. And the key thing that we learn from this is that it's not just one section of the population that's switching over, it's everybody doing it. So it's not one of those top-down things, it's when the change happens, it's something that everybody, and it ties in with the idea that what's happening here largely involves not a top-down thing from merchants or kings or emperors, but actually neighboring communities of farmers exchanging crops. And I want to sort of finish going back to your pasta arrabbiata and another shot of both the knife and fork and this pasta noodles. Now, another bit of work's been done on these noodles is they have found some microfossils which can be related to millet within these noodles. But there's a counter-argument that you can't actually make noodles out of pure millet flour, that you need to mix it with something, and you mix it with wheat flour. And so although they haven't yet found direct evidence of wheat from these, and that may come, we're pretty much sure that this is an early fusion meal that has wheat from the west and millet from the east. And it's also fusion in terms of that cuisine. On the one hand, it's not like, it's neither like, pasta is neither like the baked loaf, nor is it like the gooey, sticky rice. It is sort of halfway between the two. And so just as a kind of bit of speculation, as well as, I think what's happening, I should say, is the reason these crops are being mixed together ties back to those 2 stories I mentioned at the past. There's a lot of ecological advantages to mixing your cereals and having a large grain cereal like wheat, and also a tough, ecologically hardy cereal like millet together. It allows you to do new things. So I think there's a lot of, one can understand the ecological advantage, but we can also see the other narrative going on, the culinary narrative of new ideas coming about what it is to eat and what that means about sharing food generally. So I'll leave it there. And I want to thank 2 groups of people. I want to thank my team, which includes 3 members who have been Darwin Fellows and 3 who've been Darwin Associates. But I also want to thank my collaborators in this presentation, who, when I said to Ivan and Fergus, could we just chuck a bit of millet in, just so and they said, and they just, through their initiative, they say, let's not do that, let's do the whole lunch around your lecture, so give us the whole thing, and I think they've done brilliantly, so I want to thank them too. Thank you very much.